Welcome back to Mastering Change. Today, we're talking about something that impacts millions, but often goes unspoken: perimenopause, trauma, and the nervous system.
We're joined by Paula Rastrick, founder of the Brain Body Method, whose work explores the intersection of childhood adversity, hormonal health, and stress sensitivity.
Paula shares how our stress profiles are shaped long before we reach adulthood, beginning in the womb, and how trauma stored in the nervous system can resurface during hormonal shifts later in life.
She walks us through the neuro-bio-psycho-social lens she uses to understand perimenopause and explains why regulating cortisol and supporting GABA may be key for those navigating this stage.
This is a reminder that perimenopause isn't just hormonal, it's deeply neurological, emotional, and embodied. Let's dive in with Paula.
Okay, Paula Rastrick, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the podcast today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Paula. So, as most of our listeners will already know, we start every podcast with a little card game to break the ice. On these cards, there is a prompt, a one-line prompt, and it's to invite you to tell a little bit of a story about yourself so that will help you connect to us and connect to our audience who may or may not know you so far or yet. So, the question or the prompt says, when I was younger, I thought the world was ...
Unsafe.
Do you want to explain a little bit more?
Yeah, I grew up in an environment that was very challenging. At the time, as a young person, I didn't understand, and I thought it was my normal, which I think is the normal. And it's only now looking back and seeing the sort of the complexities of it that I realized that I grew up with a constant feeling of hypervigilance due to predominantly what I now know is my parents' relationship, very complex environment. But what I would now say was a dad through pattern recognition, a father who was higher on the end of the narcissistic type of spectrum, alcohol abuse, physical domestic violence, and a mum who I think did the best she could, but came from a very Victorian upbringing, which was you just keep everything in. So it was that very much that sort of from the outside, there's nothing to see here, but on the inside, it was chaotic. I was the oldest and the daughter, and I became the kind of parentified daughter. I was my dad's emotional sort of caretaker, if you like, and that happened from a very young age. And when you're dealing with the complexities of a mother and father who my mum and I had no attachment bond, I think it's complex, and I'm not blaming my parents at all. I write about that in my book, but you're growing up in a world that never feels certain. It's always walking on eggshells because you just do not know. It's the unpredictability of that type of environment. That's the best way to describe it.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely can relate. And I think so many of our listeners will also be able to relate to that kind of feeling of the world being unsafe and often, not always, but often stemming from our caregivers, unfortunately. So can you introduce yourself, Paula, in your own words and let us know about a little bit more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm a complex trauma survivor. I had a lot of things happen to me in childhood, not just the sort of parental side. There was abuse, and so I got to perimenopause in 2017, and I suffered a big fallout from that transition, and I was not very well, and I had to give up my business, and I ended up taking HRT, and it turned out that the HRT didn't work for me, and that things got worse, and there was this kind of what I would call spiraling. So I ended up in a suicidal, actually. And when I recovered, which took a couple of years, I started to think, this doesn't make sense. What happened to me? And I think because of my background, because of the way I am wired in certain ways, I like to know why. I like to know what is going on here. And so I started to draw the links in the research, and I started to look at complex trauma and menopause. That's how it started originally. And I started to look at those correlations and crossovers. But then I just started to go really deep. And over a period of years, I mean, I've got mind maps that will blow your mind. I just started to look at, right, I'm gonna now, why did I have postnatal depression and how is that linked? And then I was looking at my hormonal cycles in my teen years, and I was thinking, gosh, look at my addictions, look at my mental health, look at the cycles. And I started to relate the female hormonal cycle with my cycles and my drug and alcohol and all of that stuff. So it's very big. So I started to look across research, and I started to join the dots, and I started from when I was in my mum's womb. And then I started to map out the story and relate it to research. So it comes from a kind of developmental through adverse childhood experiences and crosses over into all of the research on the nervous system and female cycles.
What is it that you've discovered? What is it that you wish more people knew or understood from that mapping? Because I think as you're talking about that intersection between the lived and the learned, I'm really fascinated because we can all reflect on those moments and those journeys. What are the insights that led to the connection with hormones, and what, personally, I guess, curiously, it's just like, what is the kind of the key to unlocking that knowledge for more comfortable living with greater ease,
I think in the trauma world, we talk a lot, because that's what I do. I mean, I've got a postgrad in psychological trauma, so it's kind of like that's where I've ended up, right? We talk a lot about nervous system dysregulation. So there's a lot of talk within the trauma world of nervous system dysregulation. But I think we're not actually understanding the kind of biochemical, neurological understanding of that. And so when I started to look at what I call neuro-bio-psycho-social, I'm trying to blend, it's not just the biology, but the biology does play a key role when it comes to the nervous system. I was looking at your psyche, and I was looking at psychosocial stress, because this is actually way more complex than what we first, I think, understood it to be. But when you look at the nervous system, the research that I've looked at is starting from very early in the womb, you've got your mother's stress being passed to you, which, and I'll make it as simple as possible, which then is starting to already shape your hormonal profile. So you're already having that hormonal profile starting to be shaped. Your stress sensitivity is starting to be shaped by your genetics and your mum and your heritable traits and genetics. And then you have that convergence of, when you come into the world, what was the attachment like? So what were those attachment processes? What was the quality of that? Because when we look at the research then into attachment, which is fascinating, you're starting to look at how the nervous system biologically is being shaped by the attachment processes, predominantly from your mum, and oxytocin, and getting that oxytocin. And when you look at the research, you can see that lower ratios of oxytocin within complex trauma survivors. You've got, for me, this is where I think is key when I was looking at it, is it's the GABA system, which is your stress response. So if you're if you're coming into the world with an already more stress sensitive response, then I'm saying you're more sensitive to your environment from the start. And it's around this kind of sensitivity, and then you're mapping it through attachment processes. And when you map it through attachment processes and then into adverse childhood experiences, because we know we've got research in adverse childhood experiences, that area's not as grey, but this is before you arrive at puberty. And your sex hormones and your reproductive hormones, they join in at puberty. So why is it then that my periods start and my cycle starts, but I've already had a mapping of my nervous system, which is already more stress sensitive? And I believe that that missing link is that higher cortisol ratio, lower GABA, which is your inhibitory system, because they all cross over. So when you look at your neuroendocrine system, you're looking at your nervous system and your ovaries and the communication between the two. It's not just your reproductive hormones. They are interacting with your nervous system. So there's a biological, which is complex. I don't want to kind of go, too over the top, because you need to see the story of it. And then you go into your very stress sensitive teenagers. So we know the brain and nervous system, that sort of teenage adolescence, it's a very sensitive time, very stress sensitive time, higher cortisol. And that's when all of your biology is starting to come together. So your neurotransmitters are starting to sort of wire, and they're coming together because they come into kind of maturation at around about 24. So you can see how there's lots of epigenetic changes that can happen. As I said, it is complex, but I believe that underlying female hormonal cycles is what's called the balance of excitation and inhibition in the nervous system. And I don't think there's anyone that's joined those dots. I'm the first person to have done that.
And what does that mean then for the female, kind of when you start your periods? Is there a difference that you see in children who had the kind of stress in the womb and then bad attachment or difficult attachments with parents, and then start to menstruate? What can you see in those women or girls?
So the research is starting to point to, and this is a lot of research that I've cross-referenced, is you're starting to see what's called like heavier periods. So you've got higher excitation. Does that make sense? It's like almost like higher inflammatory responses.
Mm-hmm.
So, and honestly, this is not recognized within the medical world. So I am speaking a very new language. But when you look at the research in a lot of the female neuroendocrine, you're starting to see, if you really look, that higher ratios of inflammation are linked to that higher stress response, that immune response. And it's a dysregulation of the HPA axis and the HPG axis, which is your stress response, your biological stress response, and then your female hormones. Those two, they're cross-talking to each other. And if you've got that higher stress sensitivity, which I keep repeating, it's complex because it's epigenetic, right? You can have multiple changes in that stress response. Then you have what's called, I would say, a higher adrenaline, higher excitation, and you have what's called a narrow window of stress tolerance. So if you've already got a narrow window of stress tolerance and your hormonal fluctuations start to go up and down, you haven't got as much regulation to be able to handle that disruption. It's like an internal disruption. Does that make sense?
Well, it totally makes sense. And from an anecdotal perspective, and I think this is probably why you kind of, when you realized it from yourself and then you kind of voiced it on social media and stuff, you've realized that a lot of people are kind of resonating with what you're saying, because
there's a lot of people resonating.
Yeah, just you saying it now, like, I mean, I know that my mum is a very stressed person, always has
Yeah,
been. She was very stressed when I was being born or in her, in utero. Then the attachment that I had with her was difficult. And then by the time I started my very, very heavy and abnormally heavy periods, and have had abnormally heavy periods forever, and then diagnosed with ADD and on the autism
same.
spectrum, and I just can see all of this, just as you said, mapping out myself
Yeah,
exactly the
yeah,
same. Now I'm
yeah.
petrified to come into my perimenopause, so I have to say I really don't want.
No, I think this is the thing, right? It's that perimenopause is a major. So you've got three major brain nervous system recalibrations, really. You've got puberty. Perimenopause is like puberty in reverse. It's kind of like this. So you've got puberty, which is major, right? Then you've got pregnancy, and then you have perimenopause. Now, when you get to perimenopause, and we're now starting to understand, I mean, bearing in mind, we didn't even start talking about this until a few years ago itself, so there's all this new stuff coming out, and I'm really conscious of that. When the biomedical kind of approach to perimenopause is very much about it's low estrogen, and you have low estrogen. And I disagree with that based on research. I think it's progesterone that you lose first, which is your stress buffer, right? So if you actually start to look at it, it doesn't make sense, a lot of what people are saying, because, and that's complex, the progesterone element, but progesterone is your natural, it works with your GABA and your stress response, right? So if you've already got a narrower window of stress tolerance, because we know that that's what can happen, then when you lose your progesterone, your natural progesterone, that buffer, that resilience is even less. So your window of stress tolerance gets smaller. And that, I think, is and it dysregulates an already sensitive stress response. And I think it's the sensitivity of the stress which is why some women who have a background like me, and crossing over into neurodivergence, because that's a whole different conversation, but if you look at it, it's all crossing over. It's the heightened stress sensitivity that causes more of an issue. And if we can start to understand that, then we can have better things in place for women. And we've also got the added extra of old trauma seems to resurface in perimenopause.
Great,
And
fabulous.
yeah. And I think, again, that needs to be recognized. Why? Well, there's a biological aspect, which is the sensitivity of the stress response. But I also think there's another, I think it's a bit of a transition, from a kind of psyche. Do you know, it's not just this bio transition. It's about women sort of shedding. There's a kind of feeling of like, do you know what? I'm kind of shedding these layers, and I'm going to step in, almost, for me, trying to step into what I call post-traumatic growth. So a
Great.
time of shedding. Do you know what I
Fabulous.
mean? It's not just this miserable. I'm like,
Yeah.
take it by the horns, guys.
But how do you do, okay, great. So how do you do that safely, right? Because I think there'll be a lot of people who are unprepared. They're bumbling along their lives, and they've had, heavy periods, and they had the trauma in their youth, and they kind of got over that and maybe worked through with therapy and are now in a good space. And then all of a sudden, boom, like a massive truck, pretty much, I think what happened to you, they get
And I
hit.
didn't understand it. Yeah.
You didn't know. So how do you allow people to do that shedding and that blossoming and that post-traumatic growth? Well, how do they do that? How do they get that instead of going into a mental hospital and being suicidal?
Yeah. So I think you've got this is a little bit more controversial because it's not recognized within the biomedical model, but I'm going to say it. I think in early perimenopause, I actually believe that for some women, taking bioidentical progesterone is actually something that we should explore. because there is, there's something there to help with your stress buffering. That's one option. And again, that is complicated. So I'm going to keep that kind of simple. The second one is that I'm looking at the moment is the research in heart rate variability. So looking at HRV training, and that is in the research. That's my background. I used to work in sports science, and we used to do this all the time, the brain-body connection. So women with a trauma history have, if you look at the research, have lower vagal tone. So we have that low vagal tone and low HRV. So
hang on, sorry, can I just stop you there a second? So I have this ring, this Aura ring, right, which measures my HRV, what is it, HRV? Yeah, the
yeah,
difference.
so heart rate variability, yeah, I
am constantly dying. Like I'm constantly at number 7, or like I've got such a low heart rate variability that it always says to me, watch out, and so that's, yeah, okay, didn't realize that was
your parasympathetic nervous system. If we look at the nervous system, right, and you look at trauma and you look at the nervous system, again, that's your lower GABA. You have higher sympathetic tone and lower stress resilience and lower vagal tone and lower sort of parasympathetic. So I was looking at, you can get, this is what I'm looking at the moment, researching, but you can look at, that might give you the information, but how are you actually regulating that? What are you doing to actually work on that tone?
Well, it goes up a bit if I, don't drink and sleep better and, do a bit of exercise.
And again, honestly, you can't underestimate that lifestyle stuff, right? But when you actually think about, can I consciously, which is what I started to look at, can I work on strengthening my brain-body connection? Can I do that? Can I create more stress resilience? Because it's about the stress resilience. So I started looking at, I've become a practitioner in the Safe and Sound protocol. I don't know if you've heard of that. So I'm looking to combine some EMDR work with some, so again, it's looking at combinations of things. But when you look at things like even magnesium, looking at magnesium, looking at your stress sensitivity, and I'm afraid it's hard because people say, well, I haven't got any time. The one thing that you do need to make time for is actually working with your brain and body, because we are living such busy lives that all we're doing is pushing ourselves into more sympathetic flight fight, and we're wondering why higher cortisol is giving us worse symptoms. So don't believe it's impossible. I think we just need to understand that if you're coming into perimenopause like I did, crashing into it, because I had no understanding of my stress sensitivity, you are going to potentially have a problem. However, if we start to understand that there are things you can do to mitigate it, then you are able to handle that more. But, in truth, I think a lot of people, I did go do the trauma stuff through EMDR. I did do that because for me, that's why I'm doing EMDR, because for me, that was an important piece of the jigsaw. And
had you not done
to move forwards.
Had you not done that before? Had you not done that work before the perimenopause happened? No. Okay, good.
And I'm being honest, I think when I looked at it, I think you don't tend to. I'm the type of personality that's like, keep going, keep going, keep going until I crash.
No,
well, how many women are like that?
No, I'm lucky because I crashed from addiction, like serious, like train wreck addiction. So I went to such a terrible place that I actually then did the trauma work because of that. So I hope that that's sort of hopefully dealt with. But then you said it comes back again, which I'm...
Well, no, it can resurface just because of the stress sensitivity. The heightened stress sensitivity can resurface things. But, 20 years ago, after I had my first child, I had postnatal depression. I would say that I did do a lot of work then, because I realized then, 20 years ago, that I was somebody that was more sensitive. So I didn't do EMDR at that point, but I started studying yoga and I trained in yoga, and then I started to change my life because yoga became something that was something that I needed for my nervous system. So it's about understanding that you have to put things in place. Women are struggling, but you can get help, and there are things that you can do. I think we need to understand progesterone more, if I'm being honest. I think we need to understand progesterone's role, rather than focusing all on estrogen. We're very heavily focused on estrogen.
I mean, we work a bit in the integrative medical or integrative space, I would say. And I mean, I personally have worked with functional medicine doctors, and I
Right.
think there is an understanding in that world more. Certainly, I was told to take progesterone maybe 5 years ago, because I went and had all of these tests, and one of the things that flagged up for my functional medicine doctor was my cortisol level. She said she'd never seen such high cortisol levels in anyone other than a terminally ill cancer patient. And I was like, oh, but I feel fine. Like, I'm totally fine. Like, I don't feel
That's how you function. That's what I mean. We function like that.
Yeah. So I
It's
think
not healthy.
no, it feels fine. It's great. I don't want to do any yoga. But I hear what you're saying, and I think and so I was given progesterone. So I think in that world, and Emma knows a lot more about that world than I do, to be honest. But I think,
Really?
yeah, so I think in that world they are understanding progesterone and its role, and magnesium and the rest. But Emma, you can speak to that more.
Well, I'm not a clinician, the caveat, no doctor, but
No,
I am
neither am I.
definitely,
So
yeah, invested in that field. And I am really interested in understanding how the bridge between trauma and integrative medicine, because it's like the two don't have enough connection at the moment, but there are tools. And I think what you're describing, Paula, is what I kind of, by virtue of what we do, which is really to be able to sit in great company with people who are asking these really important questions and join
Yeah.
some dots.
Yes.
What you're describing is equipping women with a toolkit that wherever their jumping off point, whether that's me equipping my 10-year-old as she's heading into that transitionary with tools and techniques for optimal well-being and for the smooth, or whether we're talking about, you know, there's so many things out there that can help, that can be additive. You know, we talked about the brilliant basics: exercise, nutrition, movement,
Yeah, I mean, this is
daylight, sleep.
researched, you know,
This
it's sometimes
absolutely
it's kind of getting missed, isn't it? That our brains and bodies are designed evolutionary to do these things. It's just that we're living in a very different way, almost against our brains and bodies in some ways.
totally. We had a great conversation with Leo Prienblum, who was talking about the fact that it's like we're living on Mars. If we go,
Yeah.
the amount of change in our environment in the last 100 years, there's absolutely no way we can have evolved to adapt to the change in environment in which we're living in. The disconnection with our food source, with you know,
Yeah.
the earth and the soil, how we engage and communicate like this and not in real
Social
life.
contact. Social
Absolutely.
contact. I mean, that we know that social contact boosts oxytocin. We are social creatures, and look how that's changed. You know, I don't want to be, that is all going to be affecting our biology and our psychology. You can't
Yeah.
sort of just dismiss that element of our evolutionary development in a world that's becoming crazier by the day.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that
And it's the change as well in such a short period of time as well. Like, so
Yeah.
in the last 50 years, possibly
Yeah.
less, it has changed so much, you know, compared to the 100 years prior to that. And that's come with,
Yes.
you know, cars and the internet and these devices that we have and all of that. It was going fast before that, you know, it was going fast before the internet came. And then suddenly it's just kind of expedited itself in another direction, that we are living in a totally different world to even 50 years ago, you know. Um,
And I think if you look at women, if you look at just, from that perspective, because I've looked at that, I looked at the research in looking at, um, as a woman, there's hardly any research in women's health. We know that, right? Which is in itself absolutely, diabolical, right? But one of the reasons is because of our cycles and because we're too complex to research. Okay. And when you look at women's cycles and you look at the way that we are biologically designed, we are nowhere, our bodies and brains still are developed to do that, right? But we're living, as you said, in a world that is completely not equipped. And also you've got to look at women that, we're trying to do, I mean, the kind of we do it all era, of women. We are, we're working, we've got children, and we've got, phones that are, everything's coming in, isn't it? And if you've got any sensory overload from complex trauma, which is one of the stress, your sensory sensitivity, and your stress is going up, I'm not surprised that we are struggling with our hormones. I know that sounds simplistic, but it's true, right? It's true. And so if you're already sensitive, we need to understand this stuff.
and it's like you said, like, what is the environment that we're living in actually doing on a physiological, on a biochemical level to our systems? Like, how is it changing? What is happening within us that we don't understand? Like, as you said, there's not been the research done, but it must be the way that we don't interact in the same way anymore with people. The whole oxytocin piece,
Oh, it's huge. Oxytocin is so underrated.
yeah, but certainly around COVID times, for 4 years
Yeah,
or something, no one touched. Like, there
no,
would be people who didn't have a hug in 3 years, maybe. And that's like, what would have that
exactly.
done to those people, And it's like, we don't, yeah, it's,
Well, also the demise of, that nurturing, caring role that was,
Yeah.
whether it was children, then caring for elderly parents,
Family
for there's
structures have
families,
broken
yeah,
down
which
in the
is
way
kind
that
of,
we would not have broken down before. Yeah.
yeah. And that's why I'm
You
really kind of fascinated with the, that endocrine response to kind of what is how our bodies are trying desperately to, kind of find a North Star against this kind of really dysregulating environment.
yes.
And I think, what you're describing is resonating so well because people are living that. I mean, if you look at the trajectory of conversations around the menopause, because people are just seeking knowledge and information to try and align to a more favorable state of being against that, that feeling that my body's working against me or that I'm not
Yeah.
quite in a good flow state. So I mean, I think the work that you're doing is really interesting and super important. And I think that somehow the dots need to be joined by the works of like Anna Cabeca, who talks a lot about the power of oxytocin. You've got Felice
100%.
Gersh on, project. There is like a growing body of physicians, practitioners, people who are kind of really invested in understanding this. I think could be a very interesting community, which is what we're lacking, and conversation, which is what's
I
needed.
think the joined up thinking is lacking. I think the joined up thinking between, the biomedical model and the trauma world is disconnected. And this is one of what I'm campaigning for. I'm saying you can't treat women effectively without a trauma informed model.
Yeah,
I am very strong about that because of my own experiences. If you don't have a trauma informed model, we don't. And unfortunately that goes wide. I mean, you've got women, it happened to me where, they're having hysterectomies, we're having because of hormonal sensitivity, right? Now, hormonal sensitivity is a neuroendocrine, they're joined up. You can't separate you. So women are having hysterectomies and then having the trauma of having their womb removed with absolutely no counselling and no understanding of the trauma that brings in.
Well, I almost did that because of my heavy periods. So I almost
Yes.
had a hysterectomy because I was just like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. I've had my child.
Yeah.
I'm ready. Oh, an ablution, whatever. That was another option.
Ablation.
Yeah, that one. Yeah. And actually what I didn't, and my functional medicine doctor told me not to do that. And then, but she also advised me against having the coil. But actually, the only thing that ever worked for me in my for my periods was the coil, and
Yep.
I've got onto the coil now, and that is actually having a really massive effect. It's helping me a lot in a lot of ways, from a mood perspective, from a
This is a good one. Yeah.
yeah, so from a period perspective, from a not like Emma, you'll remember, but a couple of years ago, I bled for 6 months straight, just
Oh, that's awful.
heavy bleeding, like not just a little bit of bleeding, but like serious,
Yeah.
serious kind of having to run to the loo every half an hour for 6 months, to the point that I thought there's got to be something wrong with me, and there wasn't. I did all the tests, there's nothing wrong with me. So then I've now gone back onto the coil, and it has been great. And a lot of people say don't do it, but for me it's
I think
worked.
this is a really good point, right? Because this is also what I talk about, and it is very complex. But why is it some women have an adverse reaction to the Mirena coil and some women swear by it, right? Why is it some women love the contraceptive pill and some women hate it? It really affects their mental health. Why does bioidentical progesterone cause an adverse reaction in some women and not others? And it's again, when you look at the research or you start to join the dots, I believe this is true epigenetics. And this is why we're so individual, right? Because when you look at the nervous system and you see how many epigenetic changes there can be, one woman's high is another woman's low. And this is what we've got to understand, because if we're saying everyone gets treated the same, which is kind of how the biomedical model is, it's very cut and paste, then we're missing out and I know it's complex, but surely we are complex. And actually, we deserve a more joined up model to understand how trauma can impact epigenetics. And I'm just going to give you that last one. So when I've been looking at the research in PMDD, that's really significant, because when you look at what trauma can do, stress and trauma can dysregulate, block, or sensitize GABA receptors. And this is a major, major factor that's not recognized, because that dysregulates the nervous system. And again, we're not really understanding those epigenetic changes that can happen. And I think we need to join the dots more to get better help for women, because what suits one won't suit another.
No, and it's so true. But the barrier to this, right, is because it is so expensive to get all these tests. You have to get so many different tests to see what your particular system is going to respond well to, what it will respond badly to, whether it's going to like the progesterone or the Mirena or the GABA or the whatever.
100%. Yeah, yeah,
Please
yeah.
go buy GABA online, because someone listens to this podcast and says, I'm just going to go and buy some GABA online because I
No,
could be a
yeah,
disaster. Absolute disaster. You wake up suicidal,
100%.
you know?
Yeah. And
So
this is the issue. I think so for me, it's more about understanding the nervous system and the understanding of the nervous system, because the nervous system is the central thread through all neuroendocrine. If we're only looking at it from an endocrine position, we're missing the nervous system. And if we're looking at it from the nervous system, we're missing the endocrine bit. It's like we need a bridge that actually crosses to understand the complexity of those two systems. I mean, we know we're made of multiple systems, but that neuroendocrine system is currently only being looked at either from an endocrine perspective or not even a neuro. I would suggest that neuro bit's missing, that nervous system bit. And I think the work that I'm trying to do is to say we need to understand that nervous system in order to help women have the best treatment. And a lot of trauma affects the nervous system. And I think that's the bit, one of the key bits that we are missing, that bridge, that link between understanding that nervous system and the complexities that are crossing over from trauma. I mean, no one really talks about the trauma research within female hormones. It's there, but they don't really talk about it. I mean, if you had people on that are talking about that joined up approach.
No, that's why I reached out to you.
Yeah. And this is why I'm so passionate about it, because if we don't start joining it up, we're not really moving forwards. We're kind of just treating women in these silos. And I mean, I know you've said that you went to a functional practitioner. Really, truly, I think women should be able to go to the NHS and have this.
Yeah, I totally
Well,
agree.
yeah, it's inaccessible to
Yeah,
most. It really
so
is inaccessible to
like,
most.
it was so expensive for me to go and do
Yeah,
that, and it took years and so many rabbit holes, and it's so many tests, and
same
it's
as me.
extortionately expensive to do that, and no one can, not any, not many people have access to that, to be fair, and like
They
even
don't.
yeah, so
They don't. And I've done the same. Do you know what I've found, right? I have found the amount of women that I've spoken to. Yes, my world is the trauma world because of my background and what I do. But when I've spoken to, and honestly, I've spoken to so many women as case studies, I've spoken to so many women. I have met women like you that have done the digging themselves. So it's really the women on the front line that are actually who have suffered, that then are seeking these answers and trying to draw this jigsaw together, right? And that's exactly what I've done. And then I'm starting to bring those pieces together and then put them back out to the world and say, look, this piece here matches this piece. We need more research, right? And it's interesting because in some ways, and I am being quite controversial, the biomedical model doesn't want that. They don't want that because it's too complex. And we would then need to reframe. We would need more trauma-informed care. And I know we talk about the need for a trauma-informed model, but how much of it's actually happening?
Well, and don't get me started with the medicalization of being a woman, because I could go on all day. Like birthing, what have we done to birthing to make
Yeah,
it
and
so
that comes into my book.
disconnect?
Yeah, because
Yeah.
how you come into the world is going to help. It's part of how you show up in the world later on.
Yeah,
And I think if we were to
exactly.
start with maternal care, we'd actually be preventing a lot of, I mean, it's a big topic, right? But you'd actually be starting from the beginning and intervening before we even get to midlife.
we had a
Regular
break.
listeners
Yeah,
playing
yeah.
regular listeners playing hypnobirthing bingo will be very tired of me talking about that, but I was incredibly fortunate to have to find hypnobirthing
That's
to
what I
give me
did. I
like
did hypnobirthing.
which do you know what? If there was one job that I would love in this world, it would be the marketing director of that organization, because I think it's like so underdeployed, so incredibly valuable to the women, yes, but to humanity. And I'm not going to keep going on, but the point is that we do need to surface. We do need to surface not only the tools and the techniques, but the science and the understanding and the
Yes.
psychology that sits
Yes.
behind why this isn't, really well understood and getting the kind of traction to try and counter some of this speed at which things have changed and lack of our abilities to adapt to that change without support. So yeah,
It's big though,
with
isn't
you,
it? It's a big one. I mean, I'm going to do what I
it is
can in
big.
my lifetime. I've made it my mission to say, do you know what? I'm going to stand up. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to challenge. I'm going to put the research out there. I'm going to ask questions. And you know what? Maybe as a complex trauma survivor, I sometimes think maybe that makes sense for me from my childhood and the way that things happened. It's almost like my purpose. And I think a lot of survivors will resonate with that because you turn that pain into something, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm really conscious of time, so I'm going to ask you the question that we ask all our podcast guests, and I think I kind of know the answer from our conversation, but I'm going to go for it. We
Go
live in
on.
a world of exaggerated fear, anxiety, and doubt. Whether you look at the macro level, the big picture, planet climate and political unrest, or whether you come right down to the individual and their relationship with themselves and all of the different dynamics and relational dynamics that live between the two, that wherever you look, it's fraught. There's a lot of friction. It's very difficult. If there was a single lever for change or a button you could push today, what would that be?
If I could press a button, I would ask for, first of all, more women leadership, more women in positions of power. And I would say that we need a more balanced with more sensitivity. So I think we need more compassion and more sensitivity. We're kind of living now in a world that's the energy is very, very almost masculine. And I don't mean that I think we need a yin and yang approach. I think we need more softness in the world. I think we need more sensitivity, people that are more emotionally sensitive. Does that help?
Lovely. Thanks, Paula. That's great. It's been a pleasure having you today. Thank you for your time, and I'm sure we'll be following up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you
So much for your time, Paula. We'll be in touch.